to see how organizations get the best out of their suppliers and really what contract management is all about. The webinar today will be divided into 5 different chapters. We'll talk a bit about what is contract management, what does better practice look like, what sort of things can you consider upfront during the sourcing stage that will ultimately make contract management more successful. And then last but not least, we'll talk about performance management and the sort of things that work extremely well for better practice organizations when it comes to getting the most out of their suppliers. My name is Stefan Gassner. I'm the Managing Director of Grosvenor Performance Group. We support our clients across the procurement and contract management life cycles. First of all, we help as an outsourced procurement consultancy put together contracts that work for our clients and achieve the maximum benefits that they intend to. We also support clients around contract management and help them put together contract and supplier relationship management frameworks to set up the organization to manage contracts in the best possible way. We've also been involved with clients who have a dysfunctional contract or a dysfunctional supplier relationship, and we help them turn this around. We further help our clients in procurement transformation and in procurement systems to set up their own procurement functions and systems in a way that delivers the most effective and efficient outcomes. So let's jump straight in and let's have a look at what is contract management. Well, I'll have this cartoon here for you, and this cartoon is one that often is used to describe the challenges as they relate to project management. What we find in contract management is that the challenges are often very similar to those in project management. They're just amplified by the fact that there's not just one organization and their stakeholders to keep satisfied. There's actually at least two, the supply organization and the internal customer organization. As you can see here, even the customer got the problem description wrong. So the customer described that a doll was needed. That the customer described a robot, but was actually needed was a doll. So the service provider could from the start never deliver successfully because even the customer explained it wrong to the service provider, so they could never be successful in delivering these services. Specific challenge in contract management is also how the project was documented, as you can see there in the lower bottom left, which is also often quite sparingly and also then not value adding. So what can we do? What can organizations do? What can we individually do as contract managers to make sure that the customer gets a doll rather than a dysfunctional robot? Grosvenor undertakes annual research on what works within procurement and in contract management and tries to understand what better practice really looks like. When we did this year, we found that 15% of the organizations we'd spoken with do not manage contracts at all. They sort of put the contracts in place and hope for the best, that all of their benefits materialize sort of by happenstance without any investment into how the contract is managed and governed. There's another 15% of organizations that only manage about 1 in 10 contracts that they have. So if they have in place 100 contracts, they would only actively manage about 10 of those. Overall, what we have seen, this is quite positive, is that about 50% of organizations do have a structured way in how they manage at least their most important relationships. So where do you think you fit in to this? In contract management, we often talk about what we call the disappointment gap. As you can see on the slide here, what we expect at the start of a procurement process is often a very high level of capability and a high level of performance that we expect from a respective service provider in regards to the delivery of the services once they have been contracted. We hope secretly that this performance will further improve once the contract is signed, because their organization will learn our organization better and can support us better. There will be additional innovation and savings, and everything will be absolutely perfect. So we have very high hopes around what the future performance might actually look like. Unfortunately, reality is a fair bit different, and we find the disappointment gap describes what reality is quite accurately. So once the tender responses come in or the quotes come in, you will see that they are often sales-related documents that promise whatever you want, but ultimately you see even in the written response that what you will get is well below the expectations of performance and capability that you had hoped to achieve at the start of the process. Once the contract commences, the actual performance that is being able to be delivered on the ground is often well below that, yet again, of what was promised in the tender response. If now no active involvement of a contract manager is ascertained, that actual performance will further erode, and that disappointment gap between what the future vision for the performance and the contract was versus of the actual delivery on the ground of the performance is a fair bit lower. So that's what we call the disappointment gap. This is where contract management comes in. So contract management is the art, or sometimes also the science, of trying to influence all of the stakeholders involved and the organizations involved to close the disappointment gap. So in a way that maximizes the benefits that we have promised our organization, our stakeholders from the start, in a way that minimizes the operational and commercial risks, and that keeps the supplier honest, that keeps them to what their tender response actually promised us, but also what a potential second supplier would have been, or different supplier would have been able to deliver to us. The good news in all of this is it's actually not too hard. A lot of it is good common sense, and we'll find it's not too different from how we manage staff as well. Ultimately, good contract management will make you and the supplier look good, so it should be a no-brainer, really, shouldn't it? So what does better practice in contract management look like today? First of all, when we talk about contract management, there is a bit of a hierarchy here about what it actually is that we mean. So contract management at the bottom of this hierarchy pertains to the management of often what is hundreds of contracts within an organization. Often there is more than 1,000 suppliers in an organization, and all of them have at least one contract. And these contracts are managed through contract management in a distinct way. So they are optimized to deliver whatever that specific contract is meant to achieve. Above that is vendor management. Vendor management is something that we often find in ICT organizations. There's often hundreds of suppliers that have multiple contracts with the organization. So rather than managing a distinct contract with a supplier, you're actually managing the vendor relationship with a supplier that has multiple contracts. For example, you might find that some vendors have a dozen or so contracts with the organization. Rather than individually managing each of those, you manage them as a bundle at the supplier level. That is an amount of effort that can't be invested into all of the suppliers. So often we find that organizations only focus on their top 10 or top 20 suppliers to apply vendor management to. Organizations distinguish the risk and the value profile of those vendors in determining who should benefit from vendor management versus who will be managed differently. Ultimately, it's all about establishing a business-to-business relationship with those suppliers that have several contracts held with the organization. Strategic partner management sits again on top of vendor management, and it only pertains to the key partners that are critical to your own business. So that is organizations that have a very high overlap in their own future strategic direction with that future strategic direction of your organization. We find that that is often only the case for about 3 to 5 key partners that your organization has. And both of those parties need to be willing to invest significantly in the relationship in order to generate those beneficial outcomes. For the purposes of this webinar, we'll actually only focus on the contract management layer. In our research, we have asked organizations, what does make the difference in how the performance of the service provider reacts to your contract management practices? So what you can see here in each row of this table is what are those interventions that the organizations have tried. Secondly, at the very right-hand side of the table, you can see how much the performance was influenced, the performance of the service provider through those interventions. So let's give you an example. We make efforts to understand the supplier's business and aspirations. Organizations that have used this intervention and have actually tried to understand the supplier's business and its aspirations have been able to boost the performance of those suppliers by 11% over those organizations who do not use that intervention. The middle column in this table talks about how many participants in this sample of almost 100 organizations actually used the intervention. And we found that this specific one, the one of understanding the business's aspirations, the supplier's business's aspirations, has been only very rarely used. So talk about a quick win here, right? So if your organization is not yet using this intervention, I would recommend you look into it because you could boost performance by about 11%. Similar to this is the fourth from the top here, where suppliers are helped to develop their own business by the client's organization. Again, something that is only used sometimes by the organizations that we surveyed, but could still lead to a boost of 8% when it comes to the performance. Other improvements are to have clear processes and systems in place that support staff to manage suppliers. It's quite a commonly used intervention, and it boosts performance by 9%. Educating your supplier on your own strategy and business and sharing of information about your upcoming pipeline is something that surprisingly only very few organizations use, but those who do get a performance boost of 9%. Also very rarely used is a tactic around being very specific about what good looks like, what does good performance look like, and how do we assess and manage the performance of the supplier. Organizations that have clearly thought that through and communicated that can still get another 7% of performance. Note at the very bottom of this is also suppliers that have been made clear by their clients what they can expect in case of underperformance. It's the yielding of sticks that clients often use in terms of how they think they can manage suppliers. Thankfully, that's only very rarely used, and it probably is only very rarely used because it has a minimal impact on positive outcomes in the performance of the supplier. We'll talk about that more later on. On this slide, you can see the typical contract management life cycle and the contract life cycle. It includes two stages. The first one is the sourcing stage with steps 1, 2, and 3. And then the contract management life cycle, which is steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. It is very important to consider this whole life cycle if you want to improve contract management outcomes. It is not possible to only improve contract performance if you start, say, at step 4 of this cycle. Good contract management requires the intervention straight from the start of planning the procurement. It requires you to approach the market in a certain way and in selecting the right service provider. Of course, if your procurement plan was only to buy a robot, you will never get throughout the life of this contract a successful outcome, which was for a doll, if you remember the cartoon from the start. Likewise, if you approach the market for the wrong services, if you approach the wrong service providers, if you select the wrong service providers based on the wrong priorities that your business has for this contract, there can never be a successful contract delivery. If the contract is not implemented well, you'll be playing catch up for the rest of the life of this contract. If you do not have written processes and documentation of how the contract will be managed to success, you can only hope for the best, but you certainly won't achieve great performance. If you think that the service provider will manage themselves without you having to track their responsibilities, risks, or monitor their performance, if you don't review the contract regularly and the health of the relationship, you cannot actually achieve those things. If you don't consider the performance of the service provider at the contract extension or closeout stage, but only contract again with this service provider because time has run out for you to approach the market again, you will never achieve great performance of a service provider. So let's focus a bit on the sourcing part. The sourcing part, of course, are the first three steps of this contract life cycle. Spending time at the very start to understand what the business really needs, what the different stakeholders, the different user groups, what the senior leadership needs out of this contract is absolutely key to the success, to determining whether you need to buy a doll or a robot. You then also need to match that need with the market capabilities. Bundling plays a big role. All too often I have seen that organizations approach the market with bundles that may suit them, but the market does not understand or is not capable of delivering together. They might be quite distinct services. They might require quite distinct business setups. And if you bundle them together, there's only a small market to approach, and that is not going to deliver best outcomes. Also selecting the appropriate contracting model in terms of if you contract for a fixed price or a times and materials approach, for example, that of course will determine the incentives that a service provider may have in delivering more than is needed or less than is needed. The use of outcome-based specifications is all about not being too descriptive in what needs to be done, but actually leveraging the service provider's knowledge from other clients, from previous contracts and so on, in how to best deliver the services to you. The inclusion of a suitable performance management framework and how you would like to manage the contract sends clear messages to the service provider straight at the procurement stage. It tells them what good performance look like and what they can expect if they perform well. It also sends a clear message that contract performance and contract management is valuable to you, and that you allow the service provider to put time and cost against those aspects, rather than you surprising them with, oh, and by the way, you need to show up once a month for an hour-long meeting, and I'm not going to pay you for it. Choosing suitable evaluation criteria at the select provider stage is another critical success factor. We are often including criteria around cultural fit between the organizations in order to make sure that, much like in a recruitment process, you are choosing the right people to deliver those services for you. You would, of course, interview the service provider as well. Again, much like in recruitment, you wouldn't just hire someone based on their CV. You obviously want to meet with them and see what motivates them. I believe that contract management is often like good people management. So good procurement is also like good recruitment. What we're buying ultimately is professionals and a team that works for us. Yes, sure, they work for a specific organization. But if we have really good people resourced into the project and into this contract, then indeed we can expect that people go above and beyond and deliver much better performance. So let's talk about performance management and what the sort of better practice looks like around that. This research we have completed about 7 years ago now, but what we have found at the time still holds true today. We found that most organizations only achieve a supplier satisfaction of 74%. So that means that out of 100%, only 74% gets delivered. Of course, we're still paying 100%, but we're only getting 74% in return. That doesn't sit right, does it? Ideally, we would want to talk about a supplier who goes above and beyond, so delivers more than 100% performance. Only 28% of the organizations we've talked to during this research, were able to give a performance rating for their supplier that was above 90%. And really, we found what the difference is that these organizations do is that they use their soft skills, that they use their influencing and leadership skills to motivate, to develop, and to challenge their suppliers, or more accurately, to motivate, develop, and challenge the supplier's team that works for them on their contract. And by doing so, they achieve a whopping 29% more performance than organizations who do not do that. Again, very similar. What works for people management and people leadership also works for supplier leadership. If I am able to motivate the crew that works for me not just as employees, but also as suppliers to me, they will go above and beyond. If I'm able to help them in their own development, if I'm able to help the supplier organization develop their own business into new markets, into similar organizations to my organization, if I'm able to give them challenging projects, challenging problems to solve rather than micromanage them, I will get better performance in return. That's what this research showed. When trying to get additional performance from service providers, it really helps being very cognizant of the different motivations that organizations bring to the contract. I find often clients ignore this reality and they do themselves a disservice by doing so. They often just relate to their own goals, such as they want to manage down the costs. Savings is often what procurement teams need to deliver. They also want to have improved services. So, sort of a champagne taste for a beer budget. They want to document and transfer as much of the supplier's IP to their own so that through competitive tension in future procurements, they have contract mobility, which means they can just get a different service provider in and they hope to achieve better solutions through them. Now, contrast this with the goals of the supplier themselves. They want to achieve exactly the opposite in many of these aspects. They want to build additional revenue streams. They want to reduce their own cost, cutting corners if possible. They want to learn and leverage the IP in the sense of what this client exactly needs, that because they aim for client stickiness. They do not want to have a contract that's just a year or 3 or 5 years long. They want to have an evergreen contract. Now, this is the reality. We can ignore it, but we can also leverage it to our advantage. And this is what the next slide will be about. I've got a carrot on this slide because that's exactly what it is on this slide. Carrots, consequences for rewards. You can have all of the performance management, all of the performance measurement in place. If there is no consequences to achieving those performance measures, they're a toothless tiger and they actually won't lead to improved performance. They just lead to extra work. So make sure to include some rewards in your contract to actually achieve better performance. I'll talk in a little bit about sticks, which obviously would be also an option to sort of punish bad performance. But let's talk about rewards first. You know from the previous slide that service providers want to build additional revenues. So through a growth in the scope of the contract, sort of extension options or additional work around projects or in a different type of contract, you can certainly flag with them straight at the start of the procurement that there's more room to grow into your organization, but only if they do well in this very contract or in the business as usual parts of the contract. Profit motive, maybe the service provider may be able to find efficiencies in how they deliver services, rather than through having a very prescriptive view on what needs to get done. Being able to focus on outcomes actually allows the service provider to cut corners where it is appropriate to still achieve the right outcome. So that then leads to higher profit margins for them, which will lead to additional performance. And for you, on the other hand, if you're able to tap into some of that at least, it allows you to generate additional savings. You can manage the contract and the performance of it through the longevity of the contract, meaning contract extension options that are predicated on great performance can be a very powerful carrot to dangle to the service provider, who obviously wants, as we just said, have a very long living contract and a very sticky relationship with the clients. Why not pay a service provider quicker if they perform really well? That's obviously something that doesn't cost you a lot of money, so that's certainly another thing to consider as well. Those carrots will only work if you're able to ascertain whether the performance was above average. We advise our clients to put in place a performance management framework. And that is a hierarchy of different things. At the very bottom, you see performance standards. Those are the performance standards that are expected of a successful service provider to deliver on a daily basis, for example. So in the case of a cleaning contract, you might want to have the leaves in the garden to be blown twice a week. That's the absolute minimum that gets them in the door. If they are capable to deliver to those performance standards, you will consider their tender when you contract. It doesn't tell us of whether they are doing a good job. It just tells us of whether they are doing their job. So it's what gets them in the door. But what keeps them there is whether they're going to be successful or not in delivering performance. And that's what's measured with the key performance indicators, the KPIs. The important thing here is that they look at a subsection of the service specifications and the performance standards, and then aggregate that into measurable and actionable KPIs that tell you, the client, whether the service provider is successfully delivering those services. They, again, are aggregated into critical success factors. And if those critical success factors are achieved, your ultimate stakeholders will be happy that the strategic objective is also achieved. And that actually cascades from the bottom up, like I've just talked to, but also cascades from the top down. So if your strategic objective is to have a clean and safe common area within your campus, what you want to make sure is that certain critical success factors are achieved. So that's how you ultimately will determine whether you have a clean and safe area. And you do that, for example, by looking at the critical success factor of customer satisfaction. The customer satisfaction with the cleaning company is above 90%. It is way more likely that you also have achieved a clean and safe common area. Now, how do you measure that? Well, critical success factors might be quite aspirational and not measurable themselves, but you do have KPIs underneath those to operationalize and to make very black and white the achievement within the contract, and then also the more likely the achievement of the critical success factors. I've just parked before the question of what works better, carrot or sticks. So again, referring back to the research here, we have clearly found that organizations that achieve great performance stay away from the sticks. They just do not work. So if you consider having abatements or performance discounts or any other negative consequences for underperforming in your contract, what they will lead to is the avoidance of the stick, but not to great performance. And that's just how the human sort of brain works and psychology works. Humans do just enough to try and avoid the stick from happening, but they do not react to a stick in a way that leads to the best performance possible. You can only achieve that through the carrots. So rewards in contracts, much like when managing staff, work much better in incentivizing others to go above and beyond rather than just doing the minimal requirements. And that's really what we have seen in the research. So organizations that use sticks achieve 69% performance. Those that don't manage at all still achieve 66%. So it's very, very, very similar. Organizations who use carrots and those who motivate, develop, and challenge their suppliers achieve much higher levels of performance, on average between 85 and 87%. So keep in mind, and this is the main takeaway message from this webinar, to motivate, to develop, and to challenge your suppliers and the teams of those suppliers that work on your contract. Because if you do, you're about 3 times more likely to receive performance that's higher than 90%. If you want to hear more, if you want to read more and want to go a bit more into detail, please feel free to scan the QR code now that's displayed here on the screen. It will lead you to a free report that you can download that's also called Geared to High Performance. And in there, you can read more detail about our research and what we have found with our clients works to incentivize best performance. Of course, as always, if you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, through the phone, or through our website. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar, and I look forward to your questions.